I am rejoined today by two very fun guests and friends. Ron Hayden came on about maybe 6 weeks ago. Ron, you and I talked about science and scientism. He is the host of Worth Watching and a fun dude. Nice to see you, Ron.
You too.
And I am also joined by Dr. Andrea Jones-Rooy, a very funny, very thoughtful friend of mine that I love talking to. She hosts Majoring in Everything, and she has a really strong TikTok game. I think you're probably the best TikTok political scientist there is.
Oh, stop. The competition is stiff out there with those political scientists taking over TikTok, but right. I appreciate it.
I know. Yeah, that Morris Fiorita, he does all those skateboarding tricks when he's on TikTok.
He's good.
It really just blows everybody out of the water.
Yeah.
Well, okay, here's what I want to talk to you all about
Fiorina
today.
skateboard. All right, keep going.
That's I would like to enlist your help in coming up with my own rubric that I can use and listeners can use if they think it makes sense for when I have to change the words I use, changing my wordage, because sometimes I'm like, that one makes sense. And sometimes I'm like, I think you're just trying to feel special, quite frankly. And I don't want to be a dick, but I also don't want to let people kind of lead me around by the nose. So I would like to develop a workable system that we could do that. And I normally wouldn't invoke this for our purposes today, but since we are going to inevitably be going into some tender areas, some controversial areas, and some identity areas, I think it would be worth pointing out that I am the only straight guy, straight up garden variety straight white male on today's panel.
Someone's got to speak for him.
You are gender non-binary.
That's right.
And last I checked, you're okay with me using her and she pronouns, but you no longer identify as a woman. You're gender
Correct.
non-binary.
That's right.
And Ron, I'm not even going to try and tackle. Do you want to give people
I get a
brief
card for everything, you know.
Wow.
I was in a relationship with a guy for 25 years. I have a girlfriend now. I have had relationships with trans folks. So basically, I feel I should be, unassailable, uncancelable.
Yeah. You're good.
Immune.
And,
yeah, exactly.
Well, and on top of that, in addition to your myriad identity and sexual experience, I just found out that you changed your name. I did not know that. That seems like a good kickoff point for why we would want to rename things. Why did you rename Ron?
Well, when I was 17, I left my family, and I was a junior. And I really, really, wanting to not be associated with my family and having the same name as my father, I felt oppressed by that. I felt kind of smothered by that. And so a way to both say F you to my family and to claim my own identity was to change my name. So I changed my last name. I debated changing my first name, but I felt like I would potentially be sort of losing my identity if I did that. So I stuck with that. So I used to be Engström, which is a Swedish name. And one of the conveniences of being able to change my name is that I could choose a name that did not have 5 consonants in a row that people then had to figure out how to spell. So now, but it turns out Hayden, everyone thinks it's Hayden. So, yeah.
Like Engström sounds like the runner-up bad guy on Seinfeld.
Yeah.
Engström. Like it's a good one to get animated by.
Yeah.
I know one of my friends, Tyler, I don't know the full backstory, but he did not get along with his father. And so when he married a nice young lady, he took her surname, which is not very common. But his idea was like, I do not want to be associated with this family. I would rather join this new family and create this new family. I also have friends. I think what I would do if I were confronted with the idea of marriage at some point, and the party, the lady wanted to change. I kind of like the idea of hyphenating names, creating a new family. Like I'd be Heaton, I don't know, Emma Stone or something like that.
Heaton Stone?
Heaton, comma Knightley, probably, I'm guessing. Just going off probability.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I want to give a big shout out to hyphenated names. No, what's the opposite of shout out? Don't do it. It's a nightmare. As someone with a hyphenated name, the world is not set up for hyphens. I cannot find a reservation. I've almost not gotten on all kinds of flights and health insurance and just everything else. And I feel like I kind of want a team, and I'm just on this crappy team that only my brother and I are on. And I guess my mother joined it later on. She decided she wanted the hyphen, and There's got to. I don't know. It's
okay. All right.
It makes
Kira,
sense.
you heard it. You got to become Heaton, or you keep your surname.
Yeah,
we're not going to change that.
If you want to use open table, yes, don't go hyphen.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so how about this? Let's go through first some good reasons to quit. We're saying names for personal purposes, but I think for our conversation purposes today, we're talking about like we now say differently abled, or like we don't say retarded anymore. By the way, I'm going to say words that we're not supposed to say, but I'm using them in a clinical capacity, and I will establish one of my provisions. This is a personal Heaton protocol. I think that words can be offensive and impactful, but it's because of the intent and the context of the situation. I don't believe in magic, so I believe that no word is unutterable in all contexts. And for today's purposes, because we're discussing this clinically, I'm going to feel comfortable saying words that maybe I wouldn't use in conversation normally. But like retarded is an example. I have a dresser in my bedroom that I purchased from the Edmond Retarded Citizens Association because back when that charity started, that was the word that was used for it. And now we say different things because it became like a childhood insult. I recently realized, I'm real late to the game on this, I grew up saying gypped. That guy gypped me. He overcharged me. It didn't even occur to me till like 2 years ago that's gypsy. Yeah. And then I thought about it, and I was like, I don't like having to change the words I use. Like it's irritating to me. I don't enjoy it.
Right.
However, I'm like, I do get why using your ethnic group as a stand-in for thievery and a verb I get it.
One of the earliest cases of this I recall, and it's probably 10, 15, 20 years ago, once it goes past 5, I don't know how long ago it was a politician who said, "Don't Jew me down." Yeah. And just like you're saying, they had no idea what that meant. It was just a phrase that they had grown up with, and then they got in all sorts of trouble for it. Yeah.
I did as long as we're like sharing our dirty laundry, I did the that's gay, everything's gay until I was well into college and was had a number of friends who were gay, and they didn't say anything to me. I just was like, hang on a minute. I bet this isn't awesome when I say this as a bad thing. And so like weaned myself off of it.
Well, this is a thing in gamer culture because, if you're playing online games with anyone who's young, they will say gay for everything. And it is insulting. But on the other hand, almost always, if you delve into it with them, they do not mean it as an insult at all. It is just a word that is used, that way. And I mean, gay is also funny because I'm old enough now. I remember when using gay was controversial because in the way that we'll talk about probably with some of this other stuff, people felt like, wait, there was a meaning to that word and this group is now taking it over, right? And you go back in time with all the movies, the gay such and such.
Wait, so like happy people were angry that homosexuals were taking like, I'm a jolly, merry individual. Yeah. I'm very gay, but I love banging my wife. I'm not attracted to men. Don't take my word.
Yeah. Exactly. And now gay only means one thing, right? I mean, we have essentially transitioned it from what it used to mean to what it means now. And that's interesting because I don't think now nobody really complains about that. But there was a period of time where we did.
Yeah.
Luckily, in that case, that's a rare sliver where you're like, we're going to pick on the people who are probably going to be pretty good-natured about this. So it's kind of like the way to go.
There's that wonderful, I love The Office, and The Office was such a great vehicle for the American zeitgeist of what was happening culturally at the time. And like America was coming to grips with homosexuality in a way that I think we've largely gotten over the hump on. But there's an episode where he realizes that Oscar, a man of The Office, is gay, and he's been using it as Andrea did when she was in high school. I'm sure I did too. And he talks to the camera and he goes, like, I didn't realize gay meant homosexual. When I was in high school, it meant lame. And like he was using, but just, had no idea. There's also, I'll say like, okay, here's one I would like you to assess the following. We're not supposed to say prostitute anymore. We're supposed to say sex worker.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I'm not on board with this. You can sway me. Okay. I'm not going to die on this hill. I don't care that much.
I'm waiting for the hour and a half researched episode to drop. Let's go.
Yeah, I don't tend to say prostitute a lot on a regular basis, but like I feel like there are some concepts that have a stigma to them because of the essence of the concept rather than the wordage of the concept. I think prostitution is one of those where, like, I'm very much in favor of legal prostitution. I'm friends with some people that have been prostitutes. Like I don't, but like I get why people don't want their kids to do it for a living. And I find that, like, I found the weirdest example of this when I was researching college tuition. I found an article by some lefty website. I can't remember what it was. And they were trying to drum up sympathy. And so, like, this poor young woman, she can't pay her college bills, and she's had to turn to a life of sex work.
Right.
And I was like, well, at that point, you should call her a prostitute because it's clearly a bad thing in your mind. Like, if this is a vile thing that she's been debased to do, call her a prostitute. Like, you don't need to dress it up if you're using it bad. That's where I'm at on this. I remain open to changing it. And,
I have some experience in this area.
Listen to the show right in.
So, at the meta level, first, I think there is this thing where when a name change is done for political reasons to change how we feel about a certain thing, it's always an interesting question whether that's appropriate. In this case, I think it is appropriate. I don't think sex worker is the greatest phrase in the world, but I don't have a better one. But I, not only have known and had people in my life,
technician.
I've been a client of these folks. So, So I've been a client of sex workers, and one of the reasons I think prostitute longer
hold on.
is useful.
I'm going to keep you in my back pocket for everything from now on, Ron. Like you've got every category covered. I'll be like, Ron said it. I'm fine. Keep going.
Okay. The thing is that prostitute absolutely has the association of woman on the street, crack addicted, doing this thing. And that exists. And that's a real problem, right? But every person that I've known has been a woman who was completely in charge of her own life and career and doing it because she wanted to do this. And to me, sex worker applies to that much more or much better. But it might still be appropriate to say that, someone on the street doing this because they're trying to get their next hit is a prostitute and that's a bad thing.
So it's almost like classicism. It's like prostitute's the streetwalker, but like escort is like the high-end, upper-class kind of lady I'm going to go after.
Or like a nanny versus an au pair, or I don't really know that world, but I feel like we have I mean, I'm even thinking, I'm trying to because the prostitute versus sex worker thing I hadn't heard, and I'm sort of surprised at myself for not hearing, so I'm not totally sure I understand. Is it because prostitute is...
And you're a political science professor at NYU.
I know. We're intellectual prostitutes sex workers, excuse me, over here. But... Is it like how we stopped calling flight attendants? We say flight attendant instead of stewardess and server instead of waitress. Is that the problem?
I think so. I think so. I think it's shedding the old.
Because one reason you move from stewardess or whatever to flight attendant is because it was inaccurate. There are males who are flight attendants, right? And so just like firemen, you would say firefighter because there are women who are firefighters. In this case, it is a political thing. It's saying that prostitute has a negative connotation and sex worker has a more positive idea that this is someone, engaging in this. Penn Jillette said a great thing one time. Someone put out a report saying, 30% of prostitutes don't want to do this, or sex workers don't want to do this. And he's like, but 60% of McDonald's workers don't want to work at McDonald's, right? Actually, most people involved in sex work are doing it because they want to. And then again, we have this other class of people who are not doing it because they want to, and that's a very important issue to deal with.
I could see that, like, vocationally, I could see words changing either to attempt to shed negative stigma and put on a positive light, and I'm a little bit more iffy on that. It does make sense to me where it's either outright sexism built into the word. So, for example, I tend to only say actress when I'm referring to awards at the Academy Awards. I'll use it occasionally. I don't think it's offensive, but the reason that I tend to just say actor is that I know actress was originally invented to designate lesser actors. Right. Like, we don't say doctress. Andrea's not a doctress of political science. She's
I know we're joking, but I can't. I met someone whose aunt referred to herself as a huntress, which I still think is
Ooh,
very
I
funny.
like that. That sounds. Huntress sounds.
Wait, is that
badass.
a different phrase for cougar?
Oh God.
Yeah. I mean, she's real proactive. She's not just sitting at the bar drinking that martini.
she's a huntress.
She's out skulking for prey.
Small aside, the best email I ever got from the leadership at the University of Michigan in the 8 years I was there, this is not related, but I'm going to say it, is an email the entire student body got that said, "Alert! Cougar on the loose on North Campus." And we just laughed and laughed. And North Campus is where like all the undergrad engineers all are. So we just thought it was so funny.
Well, I got my own little one. So a woman who used to work for me, she lived up in the mountains, and they would have these cameras that would capture cougars that were walking around all the time. So she created all these hats and T-shirts for her place called Camp Cougar.
Oof.
And she had no idea until after she had made this investment, and then her friends were like, yeah.
Wait, so I'm coming towards a rubric in my head.
Yeah.
Feel free to knock this down. I am okay with changing language because the language itself is innately offensive. That makes sense to me. I resent changing language because the other person's trying to define the terms of the debate.
Yes.
And is trying to get me to go there. So I'll give you an example of this.
Mm-hmm.
I am very pro-immigrant. I am somewhere between doubling the amount of legal immigrants coming in versus open borders. I'm somewhere on that spectrum. But there's no part of me that could be construed as anti-immigrant. That said, I don't like the phrase undocumented worker. I've had undocumented worker implies that they forgot their paperwork. Well, no, that's not what we're discussing. We're talking
I might be an undocumented worker in that case. I have no idea where any of my contracts are.
Right. I feel like a better phrase, if you wanted to say illegal alien, a phrase that I have no problem with, if you wanted to do something else, I feel like national trespasser is what we're actually discussing. The person is trespassing within the civic polity of the United States. But undocumented worker, I've had conversation with friends about why I should say that, and they get into these kind of mental gymnastics of, well, nobody can be illegal ever. And it's you're trying to get me to come backside into your. I'm already with you.
I see what you're saying.
I resent you trying to trick me into taking your position.
So they're changing the terms of the debate to say, actually, I reject the idea that a human could be illegal, even though
right.
The word illegal exists because, well, we can do things that are illegal, but a human could be.
Yeah, I was about to say, if Andrea breaks into my house, Andrea is not an illegal person. There's nothing about her personhood which is illegal, but her status of interloping in my house without permission is illegal. She is a trespasser, right? And that's what we're talking about.
Right, I see.
Yeah, I am mixed on this because for another reason, which is we absolutely rely on illegal immigrants in order for our society to function. We need people who are going to go out and pick, whatever thing they're picking, that people who live here and are wealthy are not going to do, right? And you always see that when the economy gets better, immigration or illegal immigration increases because we need that work. When the economy gets worse, people stop coming in because they don't have work. And then they're just sending that money to their families and they're going back. They're not intending usually to live here. So in a way, undocumented worker almost seems to fit more. I mean, again, it's that stigma thing, just like prostitute and sex worker. Now, because if we actually succeeded in banning all the illegal immigrants, we would be in real trouble.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the agricultural sector would not function without illegal immigrants. Yeah, for sure.
So, Hayden, can I add to your... the rubric is, under what conditions do we all think it's okay or even advantageous to change language? Is that fair?
Yes.
We're
that is, yeah.
Not pushing against, but maybe being more trying to find some space in between, all words are subjective and relative, and slippery slope, nothing can change. You're not going to make me say Latinx under any circumstances, right? So we've got one, we all agree that it's offensive. So we're not saying the N-word, even though I specifically came on this podcast to say it today. I was like, today's the day, right? So at some point, all three of us, 1, 2, 3, we're going to do it.
According to the grounds I have set, so long as you're doing it clinically, it would be morally fine, albeit imprudent.
Do you have Camille Foster's phone number? Could you get him in here?
I do. But I do feel like it would be slightly offensive to my good friend Camille Foster to only bring him in as a black man to say the N-word when I need him. So I'll refrain from doing so, but shout out to Camille.
my voice with his voice. That's not problematic at all. That's amazing. All right, so we all agree that the word is no longer okay, like gypped and Jewed and all that stuff. So, okay, and we can have some friction around that, but okay. The second is if the word insinuates or captures something harmful. So we've got it's sexist, it's racist, or maybe not in an obvious way, like the word prostitute, but so it's not as black and white, but it's still pretty like stewardess, actress, and we can kind of agree that it's not that productive. Undocumented worker,
there's
I think,
some kind of needless distinction that feels derogatory.
Yeah, and I think the language around undocumented worker and the conversation we just had about it is part of why words are so important. Is like because it means different things, and we're still figuring out as a society what we think of those things. People, I should say. And then there's a third that I think we haven't gotten to yet, which is when we either observe something new, or we start to experience or we start to express something that hasn't been given a lot of vocabulary before. So because I'm self-involved, I'm thinking of language around non-binary, gender fluid, which were words I didn't have 10 years ago. Many cultures, as has been documented and as the left points out in these arguments, have had, two-spirit and third gender and various other identities before, but our English language in the United States has not had that word. So I would add this, and maybe you could argue that Latinx is one that people are trying to make one of those. And I've gone back and forth on Latinx, and I don't think I have really a place to say on that either.
I'm not going to say Latinx question. So this is kind of where when it comes to this kind of thing, I think that a lot of the debate that we have is needless and unnecessary.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is having grown up in a Norman Rockwell painting in 1950s Oklahoma, I know that the wonderful people, the wonderful traditional people that are religious that I grew up with, really prize civility, etiquette, and politeness. And the essence of all of those, etiquette is one of two things. Etiquette is either making people feel welcome, or I know stuff, so I'm better than you. Those are the only two forms of etiquette that exist, right? And I'm going to say the good form. Yeah, like when there's rich people with a bunch of stupid forks, and they make you feel dumb at their dinner party. That's bad etiquette. Like the essence of etiquette is you're a guest in my home. I want you to feel comfortable. And so I feel like most people that have that worldview would be willing to extend a decent amount of coverage to folks that want to be identified in a certain way, right? So like, I would imagine there are a lot of people that I could meet back in my home state who would probably not believe that Andrea is gender binary or would not have a category in their mind for it, but would make some amount of attempt to accommodate that while interacting with you. And they might even acknowledge they don't agree with you, but they would try to make you feel comfortable. And I think that's how we should do it.
Yeah.
However, Latinx, though, all of the polling I've seen is that about 2% of Latino people use the term Latinx. It's overwhelmingly used by upper middle class white people who went to nicer high schools than me and try to make me feel bad.
Well, I went to a shit high school, but otherwise I'm in that category. Yeah.
One thing is I feel like liberals who are historically coming to the defense of victimized groups and imperialism, I feel like should recognize that this term has been foisted onto an entire ethnic group by rich white people.
And ignores language, never mind culture and history.
Yeah. Well, so let me tackle this too, and again, kind of back up because I've always got to tell a story and start from the beginning. So I think the first time I ever encountered...
Wait, hold on. Did you date a Latino?
And was it at Camp Cougar?
Right. Not yet, but if anyone wants to contact me...
The night is young. Reach out to Ron. We'll put you in contact.
So the first time I ever recall the language, changing language thing coming up was going from Indian to Native American. And that was contentious. But ultimately, I think, and especially having worked in the tech sector and worked at Apple and therefore with many, many actual Indians from India, there's a clarification there, right? Because there are Indians who live in India, and therefore you need a different term for people in the United States or in America because, we happen to think that Columbus thought he'd landed in India or whatever. So that was a disambiguation, right? Whatever we call them, Native American is different from Indian. Then you have Black to African American, which I'm a little more mixed on because I've known too many people.
Negro to Black to African American.
Yes, that's true.
There's been like in terms of accepted terms of advocacy organizations, the preferred language has changed over time.
Yeah, good point. And my problem with at least assuming African American is it's not always accurate. And I've known too many people either who were from Jamaica or, Italy, or even if they were from Africa. There was a student I had once who said, I'm not African American, I'm Nigerian. And that was how he identified. Similar, I have Swedish abstraction, but I know nothing about Sweden. I've never been there. I'm an American. I have no connection to...
I think the broader argument about like Latino American, Asian American, African American is like, how many generations is it before we just say, well, you're an American, or I'm an American, or I think most people who were born in the United States, regardless of where their parents were born, would say they're American, but it's like white people get sort of a pass where I don't have to say Dutch American every single time. But we're back to black, which is a funny thing to say, right?
Yeah, that is what I use by default until I know someone wants to be identified otherwise.
And see that again. In my case, I just accommodate whoever I'm with. I don't particularly. I'm happy to refer to people however they want to be referred to, as long as it's within reason. Right. So, like, if someone says like I would rather use like there's a guy, really interesting fellow that I've brought on the show a few times. He runs a private security company up in Detroit, and he has very strong feelings about race. And he does not like the term black because he feels that black is a thing that you would call an object. He doesn't like that. So he prefers, I think it's American of African descent. I believe is what he does.
That doesn't
change.
Then I have another friend
that goes by black. And then and then Camille does it as a social construct. Camille doesn't want that at all.
Right.
I have to say, my friend Camille, who's a fellow Star Wars fan, with whom I share a lot of political leanings, but I don't get into the race stuff with him, right? So I'm happy to do that. I'm about to go over to the United Kingdom, and I'm not entirely sure. I'm just going to say black when I'm over there, because I can't say African American. That would be ridiculous.
Right.
If hello, welcome to London. And I'm like, look at that fine African American fellow over there.
I remember doing that in my head when 10, 15, 20 years ago, when that was the word that we used. My a friend of mine, Phil Duckett, has a great, he's a stand-up comedian. He has a great bit where he refers to white people as melanin deficient. So I think that might be like the way to clarify it, is like just melanin levels. How about that?
I'll say to you, I'm okay with hyphens. Like the United States went through this really intense anti-hyphen period around World War I, because there were at the time German Americans that were the largest ethnic group in the United States as of World War I. But
Irish
we were over there
Americans.
fighting those krauts, which I can say because I've got case eaters and whatnot in my family. And I think that was a misstep. I think it was a bad thing. I think like a really good example of an ethnic community that does not see a distinction between civic identity and ethnic identity is my Jewish friends. You can be a Jew and you're a Jewish American. You're very Jewish. You've got culture. You've been to Birthright. You're very American. You don't see these things as being in confluence with or in conflict with one another. I think that's actually very healthy. And I think that when the United States, when all the German folk when we're not German Americans, we're just Americans, I think that actually kind of crowded out other identities. Because if people moved into your neighborhood and you're a bunch of white Americans that speak English and they weren't like you're like, well, that's not American. We're American. It would have actually been more helpful for them to maintain the hyphens.
So getting to Latinx, I mean, I believe all the things we've been talking about here, they all have various degrees of, authenticity. For me, Latinx is absolutely an insult. All of my friends, and I was educated on this by a friend of mine who first of all, that was the first time I realized, related to what you said, Andrea, you cannot say Latinx in that language.
Yeah.
And so we literally have white progressives pushing a term onto a group that can't say it in their own language. Is there anything more insulting than that? And also one of the things they point out is we already have a gender neutral term, Latin. If you want to be totally neutral, say Latin or say Latino or Latina. And therefore, why have you pushed to this? Yes.
Ron, is that like, okay, this begs another question, because we've brought up disambiguation, great term. We've brought up etiquette. We've brought up trying to correct for derogatory stuff. We haven't brought up the negative side of this yet, of virtue signaling, of just like, this is what I'm talking about with the forks, of rich people going, I know the napkins to use, you don't know it, you mouth-breathing peasant.
Right.
Yeah.
And frankly, I think this is what, I think some of the umbrage in Middle America towards different terms is just, we don't like changing terms and it's irritating. And I understand that, but it's not a great reason if people are actually getting offended. Just, I don't want to do it. That's a tad, I get it, but it's a tad petulant.
Right.
But when it's just, there are people that are of a higher class than me figuring out new ways to sneer at me.
Mm-hmm.
And it oftentimes feels that way to me, where like new terms will come out that I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, it's been out a week and you're mad at me for not knowing this term? Like that stuff pisses me off. And it really like animates me against it. Like the best way to make me not do it is to, I've mentioned this on the show before, but like I'm open to changing this language. I understand the arguments in favor of it. However, like a lot of the time when I'm talking about dating, I will refer to somebody I'm dating as a girl. When I'm talking about like, and I don't tend to say men, I tend to say guys, like guy, gal, girl. These are casual terms that I'm communicating familiarity. Whereas like man and woman, there's a formality to it that I don't like. So I'll say girl. And right before I left New York, somebody looked around the room and went, "Do you mean woman?" And then smiled. Like her head went around like an oscillating fan.
Yeah.
To absorb the applause of all the other people.
Right.
And
Roses
I was like,
being
you
thrown.
yeah, and like I've seen this person say girl in other contexts.
Yeah.
So it's like you were just throwing me under the bus because you could and you got points for it. You're scoring points off of me.
I saw
and like that kind of thing.
A similar version to that is someone I follow on TikTok who's awesome. Her name is Dylan and she's a transgender woman, but she's been doing a series called Days of Girlhood. So every day that since she came out, she says, "This is my 10th day of being a girl. It's my 100th day of being a girl." And she'll get people in the comments saying, and she's probably, I don't know, 30 or something. I don't know. People in the comments will say, "Don't you mean woman?" And so they're telling her what her own identity is. So it's not even that she's talking about someone, and she'll come back and she's addressed it. And she's like, "Look, I actually feel very strongly that girl is the right word because I'm 100 days in. And I don't feel that I'm a woman, right? I haven't lived as a girl long enough to be." And so you see that policing even on people's own claims.
Another thing here that really bothers me is, I'm going to say again, especially from progressives, is when a minority doesn't have the correct opinion, the first thing we do is remove their identity. So Clarence Thomas is not a black man. Or we've even had, and remember, what's her name around with John McCain?
Sarah Palin.
Sarah Palin. Now, I have no love for Sarah Palin, but the first thing they did was say she's not a woman. She's not even a human. And similarly, there was a case with his Hispanic crime case, and the press said white Hispanic. With Asians, they say, well, white adjacent. So, because if they do not have the correct opinion, the first thing we do is remove their identity so we can then criticize them. And I find that despicable. Take Clarence Thomas. He grew up in a very racist environment. He had a set of experiences. You may disagree with his opinions, but to say, as even the New York Times, I think, did just a couple years ago with one of the decisions, Thomas followed the white conservatives in voting this way. It's like, how disgusting.
His own way to a particular opinion that's outside of the designated opinions of his race, which are for one team. And
I think, Ron, you bring up something important that I was starting to think about in our earlier conversation around like hyphened Americans, right? Which is, I used to, if we say someone is Asian American or we say they're African American or whatever, it can be othering and indicate that somehow because your skin is different, it's different. I get to say American rather than Dutch American. But I also worry that we would then erase the fact that folks who live in the United States and were born in the United or whatever are in the U.S. who present as, I don't even know how to have the words for it, who present as Asian and present as black. We're almost saying, well, if I'm not going to distinguish you, the whole white, like, I don't see color argument also erases the different experiences of those people. So it's like, how do we recognize that I don't want to draw divisions between races, but I also want to acknowledge that you've had probably a harder time in a lot of ways in this country than I have as a white person because of your race. Like, I don't know, when, and kind of, Heaton, you got to that. Like, when do I say, oh, my black friend said this versus my friend said this? And like, I want to honor his experience, but also not lead with that. Or like my transgender friend, like.
Well, so first I'll tell you my trick. This works remarkably well.
Right.
I think I've shared this on the program before, but I bequeath this to everybody.
Here we go.
As a friendly guy who has no ill will towards any group, but will sometimes step on a rake linguistically, I have discovered that when I say something that's not appropriate, if I just turn to the person and go, "I'm a Coors man," it ends. Everybody's fine. I don't know what it is, but for some reason, if I drudge up an accent, I go, "I'm a Coors man."
It's got to be the silver bullet.
People go, "Oh, okay," and I don't know whether I think what's going on is people go, "I don't know what that means. I don't want to dig into this." I think that's what's happening. I think it's possible that people are like, oh, he's very folksy.
Yeah.
He didn't mean anything. I don't know. That
Right.
seems to work. I'm not sure how to resolve that, Andrea. The only thing that I would add to it is that I am emphatic about rules being equally applied across the board. So if we're going to come up with I don't mind changing rules. I think a lot of the time, linguistic rules, social constructs, rules of how we govern etiquette behavior, they need to be updated and revised. But I am emphatic that they be universal. So if we're going to make a system where like, I'm an American and I never say anything other than that, but I hyphenate everybody else, that would be weird. It would be fair for me to go, well, I'm a European American. If I'm going to do it to everybody else, that makes sense to me, right? Alternately, if I don't do it to anybody else, then I shouldn't do it. Like you're an American, but I'm a European American. So
that almost feels worse somehow.
This is also where I'm a bit of a Marxist.
You're just an American. I'm a European American. I have the right napkins and forks.
Heaton
Not
and I
that European means white, but here we go. Yeah.
Heaton and I have talked about Marxism before, and here's where I'm a Marxist, which is that I feel like what it leaves out when we say, oh, you're black, you must have had this set of experiences, is that I'm more class-oriented. I grew up white trash in a poor family. I did not get a college education. I was extremely fortunate and probably in some cases had an easier time because I was white to be successful. However, nobody else in my family was successful. Being white was not a magic ticket to them. Yes. They were poor white trash. And so I prefer to look at class rather than race and such. And then you look at someone like Camille, who, you know, is a rich black guy because he got into tech thing, et cetera. So, you know, he came from Jamaica,
dressed.
You know, yeah.
I say this as a guy that has a lot of pocket squares. Camille has a solid blazer game.
Right.
I gotta look up this guy's blazers. All right.
Yeah, Camille is a higher social class than me. I guarantee it.
And me, for that matter.
Well, and this is reminding me, Heaton, of a conversation we had some time ago as well on this show about identity and identity politics, right? And I'm sort of imagining, you know, there's the people in the United States who come out and they say, I'm a working class queer person of color who the first gen and like that's like the opening bid for every conversation. And then there's the everyone is the same, I don't see color, why are we thrashing about in identity politics? And like presumably the useful mix is somewhere in between, or sometimes it's relevant to focus on class and sometimes it's relevant to focus, they're all lenses and they don't need to be at the expense of one another. But I feel like there's got to be people listening. You have a diverse audience, and I think there's got to be people listening to our conversation so far and being like, yeah, but none of this matters. As long as we lead with identity, we're going to keep putting ourselves in boxes and never understand each other. Like, isn't this harmful in the long run?
Yeah, I think your lenses metaphor probably makes the most sense of like, I try not to mention that my friends are black unless I'm actually talking like my black friend. We're talking about race, then it's relevant, right? That I'm bringing this up. But I was just like, my black friend Camille and I went to Star Wars. That's kind of weird. And also Camille wouldn't like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very much on the colorblind side of things. I think that's where we should be going.
Let me tell you a recent experience. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, I'll say like the thing that I find that I think is this is perhaps an indirect answer to your question, but I find that is a good rubric that I've come up with for these conversations that involve identity politics is if you are invoking identity politics to expand the conversation. So, for example, like it would be very relevant if we're talking about polyamory or homosexuality or gender fluidity for either one of you to go, well, as a relevant category, I know this, you may not know this. I would like to add this information to that. I'm fine with that. I think that needs to happen. I think that that's good. When people go, as a black American, I know this and I have this insight. What I don't like, what I abhor, and what really pisses me off is when people invoke race or identity as a way to shut down conversation. Where they go, well, you're a white man, so ... And the goal is they've got a button they can push to make me shut up. And like, I would never do that. I would never do that to another human being. I would never say, well, you wouldn't understand this because you're a woman. I wouldn't do that. Like, you're a black person, you wouldn't get it. I would never say that. And it feels bad when people do it to me.
We found the trailer for this episode.
But so I get it when straight white guys get pissed off. Like, if that's what they're getting pissed off at, I'm like, right, this is another example of like, rules should be applied equally, and we can change the rules, but we don't get to arbitrarily dispatch them based on what it suits us.
Well, so interesting experience I've just had. I lived on the West Coast all my life, and funny thing about the West Coast, they're the most, anti-racist, whatever, and we're going to go out and protest, etc. And there are no black people on the West Coast. I mean, they're like almost zero. And so none of these people doing this protesting.
Is Portland super diverse?
Yeah, exactly.
How about Portland?
Yeah, none of these people protesting have ever met a black person. But so I just moved to Cleveland. And so when I would be writing, say, on Facebook to my friends or something, stories, when I was in California, I might mention, my black friend, just because it was sort of a standout feature, whether that was appropriate or not, but here, and I actually said it made no sense. Half of everybody I interact with is black. It would make no sense to call out, this is a black person, So it's just kind of an interesting change of culture once you live in a more diverse place. Not to say that California isn't diverse, it's just is more like Asians and Indians and such rather than black folks.
Ron, one of my favorite subtle jokes that I do just to see if people are listening is I'll add in unnecessary adjectives. So I'll be like, next week I'm going to go over to the human blood drive. Like I feel like just saying human, it's so much weirder.
Yeah.
Or hey, do you want to go get human food? And I'll throw that out. Things like that. Just to make it slippery a little bit.
So to help us, I know we're probably close to wrapping up. So let me throw in a real bomb of a one. We talk about these political things or just like a prostitute and sex worker, there's a very recent one, which I have some personal experience with, which is pedophile to MAP. And MAP is an acronym that people are trying to use now. And actually, there's a great, the podcast Blocked and Reported had a full episode on this, so it's good. MAP means minor attracted persons.
Oof.
And I don't know if that'll ever
to that, so
I don't know if that'll ever catch on versus pedophile, but what they're trying to address there is there are people who are hardwired to be attracted to, young folks, and they don't necessarily act on it. In fact, part of their whole process is to not act on that. And so what the attempt to move from pedophile to MAP is to say, this is a person who has this condition, essentially, and then you need to work with them and give them therapy and group support, etc.
Again, this is a person who's attracted to children but is not acting on it.
Yes.
That shares our moral abhorrence of it.
But is born in a way that that's your interest.
I had to deal with this. My partner of 25 years has now died, so I can say this. One of the things I had to deal with in that relationship, and one of the reasons I had to leave that relationship, was because that was there. And, it is very challenging because exactly that. If someone is sort of wired to that, you don't, and is not acting on it physically, then, you don't necessarily want to ruin their life or something. But there are challenges, like if they have certain things on their computer, you may go to jail because, and so, being in a relationship with a person like that is very complex. I had multiple cases, because I'm a moron, where I would be talking to a therapist and I would talk about this because it was part of the whole thing. And all of a sudden the therapist would have to call the cops.
Yeah.
Or think they had to call the cops. I was very, very fortunate that none of that went anywhere. But, and there are people who are, and I understandably, offended at the attempt to change this to a more clinical and more sort of value neutral term. Mm-hmm. So I guess I throw that out there since it's new to both of you. What's your first reaction?
It makes logical sense to me. I feel like for 99% of the population, it's going to be confusing at first were we to do that. So pedophile has, as it stands presently in common culture, it is referring both to the act and the impulse, I think, with most individuals, and myself up until 18 seconds ago.
Yeah, same.
So if you say if you were to say, unbeknownst to or out of context, I'm fine with pedophiles, it's only if they touch kids I've got a problem with them, I wouldn't necessarily know what you were referring to at first. Now I know that this is what you're talking about. Very fortunately, I don't think this comes up in conversation for me a whole lot. I suppose next time it does.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
I could be more specific. Should it come up? I might, depending. That's a good point. I guess the other one too, I don't think we use it as much over here, but the word pedo is like a slang term for pedophiles over in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
So wait, hold on. I don't want to give that word up. Do I have to give that word up, Ron?
Well, it has just come out in the last couple days that in all this Hunter Biden stuff, he refers to his father as Pedo Pete. So if you want to align with Hunter Biden, go with it.
Hang on.
Yes.
Why is he calling
his father?
I have no idea. I have no idea. But yeah, it's just come out in a bunch of recordings and stuff that have been released.
I will once again have to do a very bizarre Hunter Biden Google search
boy.
late at night to discover the
You have to make a new identity just so Google's targeted ads don't get weird. I mean, I think I had the same reaction as Heaton, which is like, at first I was like, whoa, this is wild. And then like, oh, well, maybe that was my reaction. Heaton was more logical from the start. But I also see the point. And really, it's put me in a position to appreciate where I think many people in the United States, at least, are around a lot of these words, which is like the slippery slope fallacy. And I know, as a person who's studied logic and can think through it, that the slippery slope fear that, like, well, if we allow gay marriage, we're going to allow bestiality, like, is not real logic, and it's not found. Like, if we can drive cars, who says we can't skip dimensions? Like, what? Like, that's not how that works, right? But I also am sympathetic to that fear because I hear this and I think, are we going to have to start saying people who are attracted to animals instead of like bestiality, and people who can't help but snuff out life in others as opposed to murder? You know, like, I feel myself physically, viscerally, like sliding down that slope. And then I want to acknowledge that that's a slope that a lot of people feel they're on the precipice of when they hear me say non-binary, or when we talk about transgender as like, well, that means that I can't be a woman anymore, or whatever. Like, it's amazing to me how visceral the reaction is still, even though I know exactly what you mean. And I can see a really strong argument for why we would offer two names or more than one.
Okay, this is great too, because we actually haven't gotten very much into gender. We've talked about professions in terms of gender. We haven't talked about gender specifically. So let me drop something, and you all can correct me or
we're all dropping. I got to think of something to drop. Okay, here we go.
I don't see myself ever saying persons with a penis or persons who give birth. I don't see that. I think I'm going to continue saying woman and man, and if it's relevant, I'll say a transgender woman because we're talking about transgender stuff, or if it's relevant to the conversation. I mean, from my perspective, in terms of biological sex, not in terms of gender, which is how we interact with the world, but the biological sex. There's two, and then a very, very small amount of people that have multiple chromosomes, right? So if I'm talking about women and men for like birthing purposes, I'm just going to use those terms, and for everybody else, I'm going to do it with a little asterisk. But the default's going to be that. What do you make of that? Am I missing anything? Am I going into full-on Archie Bunker mode here?
This is very current news because, again, just in the last couple of days, there's on Twitter, it's viral because there's a professor who in her Senate testimony kept saying person with the capacity for pregnancy, and then got in the fight with Josh Hawley. And, you know, I
watched that, by the way, and I did not want to be in that room because my take on it was the Berkeley professor strikes me as the kind of person that knows the exact wordage for everything, and it's exhausting to talk to. Meanwhile, Josh Hawley is straight up the polo shirt wearing frat boy villain from every 1990s movie where a bad guy's going to shut down the ski lodge. Like, I was just I don't want to be here.
I don't want to associate with Josh Hawley, but I will say I do have an issue with the birthing person. So things we've seen recently: birthing person with a vagina, breastfeeder, bleeder, person with capacity for pregnancy.
I'm not going to be saying bleeder either, by the way.
Yeah, but that has actually been used recently in an ad for a company.
I'm just going to be vomiting in my coffee cup over here.
And my concern here, and honestly, is we are erasing the concept of woman.
Yeah.
And I find that very disturbing. And also, you'll note, nobody says person with penis. Nobody tries to erase men. There are men, and then there are these set of biological functions that this other set of people have.
If we want to get going on dick swingers or something, I wouldn't be against it. just spitballing over here.
For the record, because I was initially very hostile to the term cisgender because I didn't know the etymological root of cis. It just sounded like a cyst to me. It sounded like a bunch of pointy-headed people that were going to be mean to me came up with a way to make me sound bad, and whenever I heard it, it was always in a negative context. Yeah. Then one of my transgender friend Josie was like, I mentioned that to her, and she brought up, well, no, like cis is just it's a root that's used geographically, like cis. I can't remember. It's like cis coastal or something like that. And I was like, oh,
well,
so
it's
not
the Latin opposite of trans, right? Like,
right. Okay, so it's like
related to that. I feel like we have to have two ways. I mean, there is the social thing we're dealing with of people identifying in different ways, but there's also a biological
anyway, I was just going to say real quick, I'm totally fine with dick swinger.
Right.
Totally fine saying it. I'm a white dick swinger. I actually kind of prefer that over cisgendered male. Right. White dick swinger sounds better to me, and I'm going to go with it.
Right. But,
that's what I'm going to call you every time in every conversation when I reference you, regardless of what is being spoken about.
And now I'm so happy to give this award to my good
American
friend, European dick swinger, Andrew Hayden.
But yeah, we have this social thing we're grappling with. But I think part of the concern people have, which I think is very valid, is you can't lose also a certain physical reality. When you are talking to a doctor, they need to know your biological sex in order to appropriately treat you. When you are, there are just various different situations where that is important. And I think that as a society, what we haven't gotten to yet that we just need to do is just separate those. And in that way, cis, might be an appropriate a way to do that. But we cannot, the part of the problem with, a trans woman is a woman or a trans man is a man is that, well, in certain cases, it matters that they're not.
Right. My friend Charlie, who listens to the program, has told me he thinks a lot of the current rancor we have is a sort of willful refusal of people to separate gender from sex. And so he's very careful now when he's referring to biological functions, he says male sex or female sex, because that's what he's talking about. He's not making a judgment call about other things, about any social constructs we're presenting. I do want to backtrack because I think you made a really good point, Ron, and I felt like Andrea was assenting to this. You had a problem with the idea of womanhood being obviated or collapsed. What I'm now thinking is, so it would be, I am fine learning new things and adding new things. So like Andrea, you're gender non-binary, but prior to coming to that position, you identified as a woman. So like from your perspective, is that are you kind of on board with Ron? Like, is it we ought to add gender non-binary but maintain woman, or kind of where are you coming from this?
So my I'm being very visceral today. My visceral reaction is like, actually, Hayden, I never identified as a woman, and that was part of the issue with my life. But I presented and interacted with the world as a woman, and I actually hate the word woman, so this is painful for me to say. But I 100%, I am in the midst of the messy mix on Twitter of people who are furious with the J.K. Rowlings of the world and the TERFs and all of that. But I am sympathetic for sure to the arguments, or whatever that celebrity was, who Bette Midler, I think, was like, they're trying to erase our identity as a woman. I think there's real grounds to that argument. And I think it is unfair to say, well, because people who are not socially and culturally and maybe mentally women exist, we need to never use the word woman again. I think that a longer term solution is probably where relevant, especially, and it's kind of like a nasty perfect storm that the abortion stuff is coming up. So we're all have to talk about people with a certain biological framework. I think something like women and other people is enough. I'm not particularly offended if someone just says women and we mean that or females or something like that, and we mean that in bio. Though you could say, we're erasing intersex people. But I think the move towards birthers and breeders, unless that's really necessary in the context that we're specifically talking about the act of giving birth, and we say we need to accommodate people who are giving birth or something, maybe there's a medical case where we would need to say
birther sounds
it's so gross.
horribly dehumanized. It sounds like a Margaret Atwood dystopian novel.
Well, and she's one of the many who I think has been labeled a TERF for this. But generally, I think that we can and should respect women's identities, and I think we also, the other thing that I hear is that Heaton, people like you, cisgender men or cisgender women will say,
hold on.
Yeah.
How do I prefer to be addressed, Andrea?
Dick slinging. No, dick swinging.
Swinger.
Dick slinging is back to the sex worker thing. But
Dick slinging's what I'm up to on Fridays. Dick swinger is what I am.
Yeah, who we are and what we do are not the same thing. So hence MAP versus pedophile. Not that, okay.
Not that I'm either of those.
What is my point? My point is that just like I don't think we need to say European American, African American, Asian American, unless we feel that it's relevant. And if we are the person saying it about ourselves, I think we can say whatever we want. I think the same ought to be true for men and women. I think part of the rancor that I see, at least anytime I make the mistake of talking about being non-binary on the internet, is people will get into my comments and say, A, that doesn't exist, you're being delusional, or B, don't make me call myself cisgender. I'm a woman. I'm not a cis woman, I'm a woman. And I think you should be able to call yourself a woman or a cis woman as you see fit. And I agree with Ron that in some cases it may be medically or circumstantially necessary to clarify. But for the most part, I think whatever we want to call ourselves should be okay. And I think that's all right.
I very much agree with you on that. Like I'm less opposed to cisgender than I used to be, but I just personally subjectively don't like the term. I would rather say straight white guy, which I'm going to be called anyway.
Yeah.
I would rather just own that title, or alternately white dick swinger.
Yeah.
I'm okay with dick swinger too,
Yeah.
right? But I think that's part of the whole rule thing that I was talking about earlier. Of like, if we want to have a system where people get to identify, they get to be addressed according to the terminology they prefer, and unless it's something crazy like space pope or something like that, we make a good-natured effort to accommodate reasonable requests. That goes across the board. So like if I'm like, hey, like I'm not going to get pissed off if you call me cisgender, but I'm not going to change my language for myself.
Right.
I'm going to continue calling myself straight white guy, dick swinger.
And with our whole point, my whole point with the non-binary thing is that I think I have found personally it's helpful to have a label that feels better for me. And so why would I deny that a whole group of people who are proud to be a cisgender woman or identify strongly as a woman?
And I don't think you being gender non-binary in any way affects the ladies that identify as women, does it? I mean, it doesn't. You're not saying that gender doesn't exist or that nobody has a gender.
Yeah.
You're saying that you don't participate in the common binary of male and female. There's another category, but I'm welcome to continue being a dick swinger.
Yeah, keep swinging those dicks. Yeah,
me.
You're doing great.
Thanks.
One thing that may help is, at the risk of getting a little bit in the weeds on this, is I was doing a survey years ago for a company that was trying to do like a diversity census. Like we want to understand all the government makes you keep track of race in the very broad categories and you kind of know gender from when people apply, but they were like, how many religions and nationalities and languages and identities do we have? And let's celebrate the diversity of our whatever. And we struggled with how do you ask people about their gender in a way that because we were coming up with so many categories that it was like man, woman, cisgender man, trans man, trans woman, non-binary, non-flu, like what? And so I finally called up a good friend of mine from grad school who is a transgender man and works professionally as a survey researcher. And he pointed me to, I think it's the Human Rights Campaign, but it's other resources as well that are like, if you're asking about gender, actually ask it as 2 questions. So question 1, male, female, and then feel free to get as detailed as you want. 3rd, non-conforming, all in one category or something or other, whatever you want, right? Maybe not other, but something like that. And then he said, as a 2nd question, ask, do you identify as transgender? And the reason I was told that you ask it in 2 questions is that some transgender people consider themselves, I'm a transgender man, which means I'm a man. And man is my identity. And other transgender people say, I'm a transgender man, and a transgender man is my identity. And so it kind of gets around. It meant we didn't have to ask cisgender man, cisgender woman. We just said man, woman, 3rd category. Next question, trans or not trans. And that sort of is one way. It's lumpy, but that's where we ended up going with the survey. And I feel like that would almost resolve, Ron, your question about the medical side of things. Right. So it's like, we're not forcing anyone to say I'm a cisgender man. We're just saying, are you a man? Yeah. Are you trans? Nah. And that's it. I don't know. I thought it was kind of an interesting way out, though maybe people are now mad that there are 2 questions instead of 1.
Another thing I would throw in there is I think we need to have some empathy. And the thing that bothers me in the whole TERF arguments and J.K. Rowling and others is we have people, whichever way, I can't keep track of the waves of feminism. So whichever wave it is, we have people who have spent decades of their life fighting for women's rights and spaces for women. And in the case of J.K. Rowling, things like people who've been abused being able to be in women-only spaces and not have males in those spaces while they recover from that. And you can agree or disagree with them, but the thing that really disturbs me, and I've seen this in my friends, I lost a friend over this, is an absolute unwillingness to understand, maybe if you spent your whole life fighting for this and identifying as a woman and helping women, maybe you don't know where this trans stuff fits in, and maybe you have some trouble with that, and maybe that's understandable, and maybe we could have a conversation. But instead, what I see is, no, absolutely, you're just a terrible, evil person. No, maybe this is someone who is being confronted with something that changes the meaning of everything they've been doing in their life, and maybe that's worth talking about. So I feel in all these cases where people are uncomfortable with changes in the language, and some of them are positive and some of them are negative, but, I think we can at least understand why people may have a period of adjustment, and maybe we need to have some conversation rather than just condemning people for not immediately agreeing to sometimes what literally lately is like, something that 5 years ago Obama would say, and it would be fine. And now you would be practically sent to jail for saying it, right?
Yeah. Stuff, that stuff pisses me off when it's like, everybody was saying this, but then I got on a special newsletter and I learned this stuff before you did. And now I get to lord it over you and use it as a cudgel. That's the napkin special fork kind of etiquette that I disapprove of. All right. I've got a final topic for you. We can wrap up on this. I need to throw this out here given the conversation. I'm going to play Archie Bunker for a moment. Are we being too precious? Can we be too precious? Where is that line? And I'll give you an example of one that I'm like, no, I'm not. That sounds ridiculous to me. So recently, I heard that there's an effort to no longer say the word crazy because that stigmatizes people that have mental health problems. I feel like when I use the word crazy, I'm really saying illogical or I don't know. Again, I'm open to being wrong about this, but I'm just like, I'm not. This is a very useful term. It's so ingrained in my vocabulary. I'm really not going to go out of my way to change this. So that to me feels way too precious. There are some situations in which someone might possibly infer that this is that, but then like if we're talking about like a lot of the other things we've brought up of somebody I don't want to be referred to as a flight attendant or as a stewardess. I want to be a flight attendant. I'm like, okay, fair enough, right? So
you're a crazy flight attendant or whatever.
I think you're a crazy emotional flight attendant.
In the same way I was talking about earlier with the medical stuff, I think that there's a difference between regular person conversation and perhaps certain formal things. So, for example, saying don't date that person, they're crazy, is totally acceptable, right? However, a psychiatrist or psychologist just saying that person's crazy, that's meaningless, right? I mean, they have their whole set of classifications and other things. So there's a big difference between whether you're using this in a formal or informal context.
I would add specifically on the crazy piece is that, okay, so I'm on the left, as I say in every 3 seconds, apparently. Most people I encounter online and in real life, I think, are left of me. And one reason I know that, I'm so glad you brought this up, Hayden, is that they will say bananas instead of crazy. And that's how I know. That's all I need to hear.
Same thing.
It's the same thing.
Doesn't it?
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
But it's like,
but bananas is racist too, because bananas is monkeys and monkeys is black people. Anyway, sorry.
I think it'd be like, because it's yellow on the outside and white on the inside, which is also racist. So it's racist in 2 ways. Plus, we stole bananas from their natural place and brought them here and homogenized them, and it's a white supremacist tool. All right. So it's one way to very quickly, it's the equivalent of saying like, oh, I'll use the tiny fork, is like, I hear someone say this is bananas and I'm like, I know everything about your political views and I know that a lot of it I can't stand, right? I probably agree with it and you'll probably eventually persuade me that you're right, but right now I'm not there yet. So that's like the signal, right?
I know a lot of people that I'm like, oh, you're the irritating version of me.
You're the person in the Senate hearing who made Josh Hawley mad, right? But when I talk to them, I can do them the courtesy of just not saying crazy or insane. And so sometimes it's in a professional capacity. So if we're emailing about something, at the university, we're like, oh, isn't this frustrating? I'll say, isn't this frustrating instead of isn't this crazy? One thing I've landed on is I'll say wild as sort of I can't bring myself to say bananas. And I'm sure wild is offensive to people who grew up outside of civilization. I don't know. Right. But I'll say wild instead. But when my therapist says, and I refer to myself as crazy, she'll say, let's try not to use that. Like, I'll say, great. You know what? You're right. I'm not crazy. I had experiences in my life and my brain is set up in a way. I'm not crazy. Right. And I'm not offended when she says it, because I agree with you, Ron, that in that context, I think we're distinguishing between crazy as in illogical and crazy as in like a mental health something. But Hayden, I think to your broader point is I don't know where the line is. And truly, I think the arguments tend to be like, if there's no line in this category, there must be no line in any category. And I need to acknowledge if someone identifies as a lamp or a spoon, if they say they're non-binary. And the same thing with this, like, I think crazy versus bananas is a little bit too far for me, but I'm open to the possibility that in 5 years, I'll be saying bananas with everybody else. Like, I don't know which way it's going to go. And I don't know. I think you've made this point before. It's like, we're arguing over the sides because we're afraid of the extremes, when really in a moment-to-moment basis, we haven't decided yet as a society how we feel about the word crazy. And I'm sort of like, okay to wait it out and see. But for now, I'm not going to update yet. Just like I didn't update the word gay for a number of years. And then one day I was like, maybe it's time. And then I switched.
So I think this is useful in helping me develop my rubric. I am open to updating my language. I think that's a very good phraseology. I'm open to updating my language. However, nobody can just tell me, we're saying this from now on. You got to tell me why we're saying this.
Right.
Because if you just, from now on, we don't say Latino, we say Portuguese and or Spanish. That's what we say from now on. And I'm like, well, I didn't read. Why is this now?
Right. Well, because we used to say Hispanic, right? And we've moved away from that. Or maybe we're back to it. I don't know what we're saying. Yeah.
I think that there's a cultural versus ethnic distinction. The whole other. I don't believe it's a bad word. Okay. I still use it. Again, people email me, but I think it's just referring to a different thing. But yeah, I think I'll be open, but I'm just not going to take anything on like mandate. This is my inner anti-authoritarian. I don't like being told what to do without any explanation for it.
Right.
And then I have to like jump around for the amusement of other people.
And I think we can all be comfortable with it taking time. And I think it can take time for two reasons. One, people are going to have some resistance and I may feel very emotionally against MAP instead of pedophile because of my own experiences in my life or in my community or whatever, right? And I think we need to be patient with people to come around, not just like, you can give me a great explanation, but it still might take me a while to catch up with that. And language is something that is very, very hard to change. And so, I walk around saying I'm non-binary and I mess up pronouns on they, them for other people all the time, right? It's just language. We're kind of slow to pick these things up. One thing, if I may give a plug for an academic paper, not one that I did. It's called Language as a Complex Adaptive System by someone named Nick Ellis and a bunch of other people. This framework will help you feel better about this whole conversation. Basically, it says, look, language is something that evolves from all of us sitting around yammering at one another. And over time, we yammer at one another in certain ways that give rise to a change in what a word means or develops a new word that none of us really individually stands up and says, now we use this word. It's much more of an organic kind of bottom-up change. And then after enough people start using that word in that way, it shifts and eventually the broader population shifts to that, just like we went from Negro to Black to African American and back. Like it can be this complex system that
tends to be an emergent process rather than somebody at Sarah Lawrence College makes it a fatwa.
Exactly, and sometimes we can try to do that. I'll come out and I'll say we need to be saying birthing people, and then the people who make up the society are like, I don't think so, and it doesn't catch on. So we're going to see that churn. But eventually you can kind of map language as this kind of punctuated equilibrium. So it's a beautiful paper to read to just like. It honestly like calms my nervous system when people argue about words.
Yeah. Well, I'll add to that as kind of my final point to this. I think that these conversations we have, to a great extent, they're hypothetical conversations. Like I've met a ton of people that are things that I didn't know were a thing. Or maybe like I only know a couple of transgender people. I'm sure I step in it. My experience as a white dick swinger,
European,
apt to be assumed to be, the bad guy in these situations, is when I'm talking to somebody and I'm just trying to be respectful, kind, and open, I find that it is usually reciprocated. Most of the time when I'm having it, even if I don't have the same opinion, if it's just, there's a difference between going in and like, if I were talking to Andrea and going, my female friend Andrea, like again and again, it'd be clear that I was doing that to be a dick. Whereas if like, I said, was it epiphany versus presenter or something like that earlier, while that would not be the preferred wording you had, you knew that I wasn't saying it in order to be an asshole. And I find most people across the board, regardless of identity, are very capable of doing that.
I lost a relationship with a trans person because I one time used the wrong pronoun.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah. So that made me very skittish about this. Well, my final comment will be, I'll just say, person with a capacity for pregnancy is never going to catch on.
Is it a good acronym at least? PWC? No, that's taken. Yeah.
Yeah.
PWCP?
Nice.
Yeah, nope.
Well, Ron and Andrea, this was a great conversation. I've very much enjoyed this. You've given me much to think about. And I think our careers will survive, so thank you.
Yeah.
And,
maybe not yours, but we're protected. So.
Yeah.
You guys are, you all are fine.
I maintain I am on my way to get canceled by my own side. So I think this was a tentative step in that direction. So looking forward to hang out in the orphanage more after that.
Exactly. I was about to say my side's just like Hayden's a nice guy. He's a bit of a cowardly Mr. Rogers character, but he's fine. But no, I don't offend anyone. I don't piss anybody off.
Yeah.
I just wish I had more of a spine.
Yeah.
But that doesn't tend to get me in trouble. So anyway, a pleasure. Andrea, where can people check out your stuff?
Well, you can find me on the internet at Jones-Rooy, JONESROOY, with none of the hyphens, all right? And that's all the social medias and jonesroy.com, and that's it.
And host of Majoring and everything.
There you go.
And Ron, where can people find you?
Well, I am Better Angels on Twitter, and which is a handle I got a decade or so ago, and I'm going to keep.
I was going to say, you must have been like the third person on Twitter for that one.
So, and Worth Watching podcast, so you can search for Worth Watching.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eaton. Thanks, Ron.
That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, media assistant Eric Stipe, who edited today's program. Thank you, glorious patrons of the orphanage, who make the whole thing possible. You can join them and support the show by going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.